I'd like to introduce our moderator, Randall Larson. Randall is a film music critic, host of the website, which is a resource for news, views, and interviews about music for science fiction, fantasy, and horror films. Randall is also a writer who has authored a book of the same name, Mystique Fantastique, as well as 100 plus years of fantasy, science fiction, and horror film music. So Randall will go on from here introducing our speakers for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. I'm pleased to have the opportunity here to moderate this talk and explore the sound design, unique sound design of this film. The film is called The Lift. It's a 2021 Vietnamese horror film written and directed by Peter Mauragaya. He was inspired by the elevator game Urban Legend, which supposes you can enter a new dimension if you press an elevator buttons in a specific order. Don't do that. The lead character, Trang, is searching for clues to the disappearance of her friend Gina, who vanished while playing the elevator game, and her father, who disappeared while searching for her. Now, Jérôme was largely known for his orchestral film scores, but The Lift called for an electronic musical palette. Jérôme worked with sound designer and programmer Roberto Prado to develop a unique electronic sound spectrum that would fit the film's tension and suspense, yet one that still worked thematically while harboring plenty of frightening textures and haunting harmonics. Now we're going to take a look at a few clips from the film and have Roberto and Jérôme discuss how these electronic samples were created and implemented into the film score. The first clip is from early in the film, where Trang and her friend Niap go to the abandoned hospital to search for clues about what happened to Trang's father. We see the facade of the building loom up menacingly, and Jérôme introduces his main theme.
Hình như chỗ này đúng không? Trời đất ơi, sao nhìn ghê vậy mày? Tao đâu có biết là nó ghê vậy đâu. Tao nghĩ là nó bình thường. Mà Trang, cái gì vậy? Chờ tao! Mày có chắc là ở đây không có ai không? Sao tao thấy dễ radio vậy mày?
Chắc. Yên tâm. Người ta đồn á, ở đây có ma cho nên mới phải đóng cửa. Không có ai dám tới đâu.
Đồn.
Hey, Roberto and Jérôme, what can you tell us about this sequence and how the music energized that particular sense of brooding apprehension?
When Peter and I, the director, started talking about this film, we really wanted to go back to a sound akin to the horror movies from the late 70s, early 80s, specifically the Dario Argento movies, that has this kind of like unapologetic synthetic score. Because we really wanted to get that analog type of sound, and I don't have a lot of analog synth, my idea was how can we convey the major story points and follow the characters through their journey through sounds, basically. In a way, with an orchestra, you would do it maybe the oboe or a specific melody that kind of becomes the character, you know, the sound for a character. On this one is how do we do this, but with synthesizers, basically, with patches. When I started working on the film, I wanted to create a palette of sounds that I could use. And one of the things that was very important was to come up with sounds for specific ideas or characters. And so the first clip that we just saw, that's for the hospital. And the hospital is where most of the action in the film happens. That's where they play the game. That's where the elevator is. And so it's an abandoned building. It's kind of decrepit. It's very dark. It's menacing in a way. It's looming. It's this really high structure. So I wanted a sound that had this kind of like low, gnarly, menacing, foreboding type of quality. This sound was part of the long list And then Roberto can talk a little more about this, but this long list of samples that I wanted to have at my disposal when I started writing. Roberto, is that, I mean, I remember I sent you a very, and we kept expanding it, but there was some core samples that we discussed straight away.
Yeah, I remember you sent some kind of reference file, which had a bunch of different sounds, and then we tried to approach them in a way that you could use them on your score, not only kind of in the same manner, but also adding like personal touches, you know, something that make it just unique. And I think this one, the first one, is definitely one of my favorites and most unique sounds that we created. And you want me to share the screen now?
Yeah, if you can show a little bit how you did it.
Of course, of course. So let's see, I'm using Logic here. That's my DAW that we both use, Jérôme and I, so we could go back and forth and change things at will. And the first sound that we heard, I call Barry Bass. And why I call that? Because I use my personal instrument, which is a baritone sax, to create the instrument. So what happened, I remember I saw this video of a saxophone player playing the saxophone with the traffic cone inside. So he would flip the traffic cone and use it like to some kind of distort the sound of the saxophone somehow. So I got a traffic cone and I record some samples of me playing my baritone sax through a traffic cone. And I just use a small portion of that recording here, but you can hear what the original sound is. So that's the sound that I recorded with the traffic cone inside. And I think that's like 90% of the character of the sound is just on this like slow bending, low horn kind of sound. And with this sample recorded, I used Arturius Pigment, which is a synthesizer. It does not come with Logic. This synth has a lot of different engines inside of it. So it has subtractive synthesis, but it also can play samples. And this is why I chose this synth to manipulate this sound. So here you can see I'm using two engines here. One is the sample that you just heard. It has some effects. If I take all the effects out, you can hear the same sample. And the other thing that I added was really subtle bowed instrument. So it's a sample of a cello or double bass sound. So together they sound like this. And I think it really, I don't know, it's kind of dragged, it's a heavy sound. And I think it fitted the hostel really well, as we saw in Jerome's score. But there's not a lot of things going on with the sound regarding modulation. It's pretty much all the heavy lifting is being done by the sample of the baritone sax that I recorded, and also this bowed instrument. The sounds the effects that I'm using besides pigments, a little bit of distortion, as you can hear. You can hear I mapped some of these parameters to different faders so Jérôme can manipulate the sound. I mapped to a different fader here so he can manipulate the sound as he wants. But besides that, I use a pretty much a distortion plugin by Soundtoys called Devil Lock, which is pretty gnarly sound distortion. And also this one that I think I used in a lot of sounds for this movie, that this is a plugin by XLN Audio, which is pretty much a multi-effects processor. But here I love using this wobble function as well as the distortion built in here. So it just adds a little bit of character to the sound, if you can hear that. plugin. All the plugin. It does have a little bit. Pretty much that's the sound that we hear in this first clip is me playing through a traffic cone in my saxophone. But I brought it to pigments and added a little bit of processing, mainly distortion and some modulation in filters. But it's that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and I do want to add what I'm thinking while you're. I mean, this is amazing because part of it is I have not seen this. I didn't even know you used that it was you playing. You do what I do want to talk about the way we collaborated on this is before we even started, I made sure that you were in Logic, that you could deliver me patches that I could just load in my template, since I'm in Logic as well. And then potentially I could tweak if I wanted to, but very rarely did I. Sometimes I would mute something, an effect, if there's too much reverb or things like this. But part of the way we made this work was I wanted to have a lot of flexibility in the same way as if Roberto were to come to my studio and give me an analog synth with a bunch of presets, and then I could just play with it. So it was a really great way to do the back and forth. It did require, since it's not something that I invested a lot of money before in, so it did require that any plugins that you felt, Roberto, that you knew you were going to use, that I buy them on my end so that you could send me the patches and it would load right away with all the plugins. But in the end, it gives us a lot of flexibility in that back and forth. I think it did happen where you would send me a patch, and if I wasn't completely happy about it, or if I didn't feel I could exactly use it, it go back to you, and then eventually you made the tweaks. So it was a really great way of creating those sounds, working together on this. And it was a very a big learning experience for me because I had never used that stuff. And the other thing I wanted to point out was about those faders. A lot of those patches, including this one, have controllers on them. And you were kind enough to give me in this Excel sheet, each patch, you would tell me which MIDI controller, which number was were being used and what it would trigger. So I set up on my keyboard, I have 4 faders, and so I had controller 11, 12, 13, 14 that would control all the different sounds. So at the beginning, obviously, I didn't really know. I mean, I had to explore how the patch would work. And eventually, by the time I was about, maybe 10 minutes into the score, it really started making sense what I was going to use. And so a lot of the long list of patches you sent, some I've used on every single cue. Other I might have used once, and other I might never have used in the end because it didn't really fit. But it gave me this huge selection that I could pick from. So,
yeah, it's great to hear. I think having, as you said, having all the same plugins in both of our machines really made this process really seamless. So if you have to tweak something on your end, you had exactly the same session as me.
Yeah.
So it was really easy to correct stuff or change things on the fly.
Yeah, I agree. Randall, what is our next clip?
Yeah, clip number 2 nicely shows the director's use of shadows and subdued lighting in a tense scene that takes place inside the hospital. The eerie music and sound design keeps the scene subdued and foreboding quite well, I thought.
Trang, mày sao vậy? Trang, mày uống thuốc chưa? Tao nhớ là tao uống thuốc rồi. Mày có ổn không vậy? Ổn.
Không sao. Thiệt.
Yeah, again, an interesting use of texture and tonality to create a very eerie ambience there. Jerome, what can you tell us about working with Roberto on this one?
Yeah, I think for this sound, it's the sounds for Trang, who's the lead character in the film, and we basically follow her throughout the whole movie. And this is the first time we meet her, so I wanted to introduce this motif. There was no space really in the score to have big melodies or anything like this. It's more about motifs. But I mean, I'm a thematic composer. What can I say? I like the idea that music accompany the story and accompanies ideas and concepts and even abstract. But it's kind of like an intellect. I'm trying to intellectualize the writing process, maybe because that helps me figure out what I want to do. So that keeps me grounded. But so for her, I wanted a sound that felt pure and fragile to a certain extent, and eerie, but also wouldn't tell you much. It's almost like it's almost a question. That motif doesn't really have an answer to it, so it doesn't feel fully resolved. And so I wanted something, because I'm an orchestral composer. I thought about flute, which to me made sense for the purity and something soft, you know, in a fairly high register. So that was the approach behind that sound.
Okay, Roberto, can you add to this?
Sure thing, sure thing. Let me share my screen. So I think this sound, Jerome, even with the character, with her personality, I think this sound really fits the movie, you know, being this fragile, like, as you said, flute quality sound. And for being this kind of like almost an orchestral instrument, I decided to use a different, a synthet method that I'm not super, I don't use all the time, but it's really powerful, which is physical modeling, which is basically a synthesis that behave using mathematics and some fancy things that we don't need to get into deeply here, but it behaves like a real instrument. So as you said, you hear it come like a flute chord here. Let me see if I can. And it sounds like it's being like a blown instrument, something that you're blowing to, because it's actually, this is a synth called Sculpture. It comes with Logic. So it's a stock plugin. If you buy Logic, this comes with it. And as you can see, it behaves like a real instrument here. You have some exciters, what you call exciters. So here you have a blow, but you can have all the kind of impulses. You can have strike, you can have a pick. So for instance, you can have a totally different sound if I have it as on strike, kind of like a so it's really different from what we had from the blown here. This is really powerful thing, you know, and it uses mathematics to kind of emulate a real instrument. And I think that's why this sounds really organic and not as like really synthy in a way, just because this is trying to emulate a real instrument, behaving like a real instrument, meaning if you hit a note twice, the second note won't sound the same as the first one. And this is actually an evolution from a preset. This is not something that I created from scratch, but I did, if you can hear, the original one is this one. But I don't know, it's kind of almost too much in your face. So what I did was adding a little bit of this media loss here. So it's kind of like the flutist is running out of breath somehow. So if you use the mod wheel, you can hear this. It's not like only a whisper, you know. And I think this really worked well with the scene and with the character, as Jerome told us. But besides this engine, I'm not using almost anything besides the reverb here, which is also a Logic stock plugin. But that's pretty much it. That is a physical modeling synthesis that is stock to Logic, meaning if you have Logic, you can use this. And I urge you to explore this kind of synthesis because it's really underrated. I think it's underrated, but it's, as you can hear, it's really powerful, you know?
It's amazing to me how I mean, it's obviously when you use Logic on a regular basis, you know, this is cheap because it's just right there, but you can see it and it's not, I mean, the potential is huge. It's like it doesn't use any kind of sampling. I mean, you can just, anybody can start using it. What I love about the sound you created is how, I mean, it's how atmospheric it is, and yet how grounded, how organic it sounds.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to me, it really was absolutely perfect for her because we never, even the movie, if you see the movie, and Randall, you probably remember, is there's not really I'm not going to say it's not satisfactory, but it doesn't really have a strong conclusion at the very end of the film. I don't want to spoil it. But so it was a nice, it's this nice thing about this motif where it doesn't really, I don't think it ever really leads you anywhere. It just comes, it comes here. I mean, we see it when we heard it when we see her for the first time, but it comes back later on. And every time it's there, it's really, it has this sound of out of breath or of just very far away. And so I love how you tweaked it because that first sound I would not have gone for it. I would not have worked. But this one felt, it does feel feminine to a certain extent. And it's just kind of like, to me, it fits perfectly. So it really, I don't remember if we had a lot of back and forth with it. I think you got it for the first time.
Yeah, that was the first time. Yeah,
it was one of the first samples. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought, and it's a sound that actually was, I mean, to my limited knowledge of the scores from back then, it's a sound that now it sounds a little bit, it's a little modernized, but if you think about Vangelis, for example, or it's a sound that to me is reminiscent of those type of synth scores.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, there's a kind of air of airiness to it that works really well. And also it's so subdued, it's almost subliminally affecting what's going on as you're watching that scene.
Yeah, I don't think, I was watching in preparation for this, I was trying to figure out where the motif plays. And so I went through the whole soundtrack, which by the way is coming out on Tuesday. And I was listening to it, and every time it plays, it sounds like an afterthought. It doesn't sound like something that's in your face. It always feels like it's part, as you were saying, Randall, as a part of the textural quality. It doesn't really jump at you. But I think when you're watching the movie, it's almost, it stays there. And I think it connects throughout the whole film.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's move on to clip number 3. This is a longer sequence in which Trang has Niop test the elevator buttons to see if the sequence will deliver her to wherever Gina and her father may have been taken. Again, the rather subdued, growling main theme imparts menace, while a variety of electronic pads and textures maintain a frightening and a dangerous ambience. Things are beginning to step up at this point. Let's watch clip number 3.
Tao đã có cách để có thể tham gia trò chơi chung với mày rồi. Mày nghe tao đi Ngọc. Tao đã từng chơi trò này với Gina. Nếu tụi mình không quay lại trò chơi này lần nữa, thì tao với mày sẽ kết thúc như Gina và trò chơi như bóng tối mãi mãi.
Ok. Chơi.
Mày ổn không?
Biết tao mà. Mà nó thui. Biết vậy không chơi rồi.
Ngọc. Ngọc.
Gì trời?
Nghe tao nói nè. Mày phải ở lại tầng 10 và không được đi xuống tầng 5. Mày nhớ chưa? Không có được đi xuống tầng 5 nghe chưa?
Tao biết rồi. Giờ sao nữa mày?
Bây giờ mày đi tới tầng 4 đi.
Tầng 4.
Mày bật camera trước, cho tao coi coi có gì ở ngoài đó.
Ok. Mày có thấy cánh cửa không?
Tao thấy rồi.
Ở ngoài này toàn là khói không mà mày. Tao đi tiếp. Sang, mày nói cho tao biết hết phần còn lại của trò chơi. Hay chỉ có nói từng bước vậy đấy. Sang, mày nói lẹ lên coi. Mày sắp yếu rồi nè.
Đợi chút.
Nói cho tao hết phần còn lại của trò chơi.
Tầng 4, mày đi xuống tầng 2.
Tầng 2. Tao biết rồi.
Rồi sau đó tới tầng 6. Rồi tới...
Sang. 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 Mẹ nó. Mất tín hiệu rồi. Tầng 2.
Yeah, again, there's some different things going on there. Some different textures you're melding together and creating this increasing sense of menace, of danger. What can you tell us about this, Jérôme?
Yeah, it's a longer clip, and what's interesting about this clip is we have those multiple. We hear at the very beginning the hospital motif, and then we hear Knock's motif for the first time. That kind of plucky thing, which I think we'll talk about, and then we go into Trang's motif. Then that becomes very present as we switch back to the way she's starting to hear those voices, and we also have a hint of a fourth motif, which is the last one of the main motifs in the film, which is the whispers used for the Dark Maiden. And so this clip actually has all that stuff integrated within the same cue, within the same scene. And it's the nice thing about it, at least from my perspective, from a composer perspective, is it doesn't feel like anything is jumping at you. It just kind of seeps in and creates this, to me, interesting development throughout the scene and throughout the rest of the movie. So I think for Knock, I think the idea was, I mean, I didn't have a motif for her. She's a supporting character, and at the beginning I didn't have a motif for her. And then Peter, the director, actually requested something. He said, she's not the lead character, but she's her best friend, basically. And it'd be nice to find a way musically or sonically to represent her. And she's her best friend, but she's kind of a little annoying. She kind of gets on your nerves a little bit throughout the film. And she's like, the immature one, but also she's very brave. And so the idea behind the sound was, let's find something that is a little fun, maybe, or a little, so the pluckish quality kind of came from this idea of something that's kind of bouncy a little bit. Not something that Peter wanted. He wanted something that sounded a little bouncy. And so that's how I think that's how I brought it up to Roberto.
Roberto, what can you add?
Let's see here. So this is the plug that Jérôme used. Let me see if it's... And this little scene sounds funny, as Jérôme just told us. It's pretty much all the heavy lifting is being done by effects, because the synth itself, it's just a traditional subtractive synthesis. So it's using square waves, and this is another plugin that comes with Logic. It's a really good plugin if you really want to dive into synthesis, and learn, but not be overwhelmed by a lot of like tons of knobs and effects. So as you can see, it's much more simpler than, for instance, Pigments, which was the first plugin that we saw. but it does the job, you know. If we take all of the effects that we're using, so not a lot of things going on here. The thing that I think really adds the character is the beat crusher, which is the thing that I automated. Which is almost like adds this kind of vocal quality to it. And the other thing that really adds the, I don't know, the quality of the sound, I think, is this little note repetition that goes. So it's kind of like, almost sounds like a water drop somehow. So without it, would be like this. And with it, it's really like a really short up an octave repetition of the note, and really adds this kind of like almost like a water drop effect. And besides that, I also have that plugin that we just saw, the RC20, and this is one of the presets that I tweaked it. It's called Depth for Plugs, that's what I wanted. You know, it's a plucky sound. I really want some depth. So let's see how it sounds without. And with. It adds a little bit of space and also some distortion. And what is really cool about this plugin as well, as you can add noise as well. So this, for instance, has a 7-point tape sound to it, and also some magnetic, which is pretty much like a tape emulator here. So the sounds kind of in a random form. It drops sounds, you know, sometimes it drops a little bit dB here and there, but it just adds some randomness, which is also something that we love as musicians, you know, some things that make it more organic somehow. And this plugin really does the job regarding that, you know. But that's the plug that we use for this character. And it's pretty much the, you know, this is traditional subtractive synthesis. There isn't a lot of secret to it, you know.
And I do want to add that I think for the final sound, I used this as a basis, and then I wanted the sound to be more annoying. It almost felt, I mean, I loved everything about that sound and the repetition and everything. And I think if I remember correctly, I layered in another sample, something that had a little bit more distortion on it. So they would be a little less clean, a little harsher. Because this one sounded a little too round to me. So I remember having to, as I was working if you look in Logic, I would have a track and then an alias, so a copy of exactly what I did. And I kind of blended the two. So I would have the repetition of yours and that nice space in it, but I would have something a little more harsher on the sound itself. We can talk about the whispers since we hear them in that clip. So that's the last sound. So this one was definitely a request from the very beginning. I wanted over the years, I've tried whisper sounds from different libraries, and I've never been, I mean, you can find them. I know Modifier, which is the plugin a lot of people use, has some whispers. But I wanted to have something for this movie that was a little bit, that was basically my own. And Roberto, you came up, if I'm not mistaken, with one or two sounds. I noticed one that I didn't use a lot, but I loved, which is the one that's more like truncated, or it just feels harsher. I think that's the one in Pigment. Maybe you can talk a little bit about those two sounds and how you came up with those.
All righty. So I think the one that you're mentioning, we have two here. One, I think, is the traditional horror kind of whisper, which is this one, if it will play.
Yeah, that's so great to texture. You can layer that, you know, on a lot of places. It's really, really cool.
And for for this sound specifically, what I created was basically, this is Contact, which is a sample player, for those who don't know. And I created this simple instrument. So you can create custom instruments here. And this instrument has a bunch of different whisper samples, you know, so you can see here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different samples. What I did, I just basically stretch it out through the keyboard, so you can play different pitches within the same sample. That means if you play, for instance, let's see, this one here. If you play the same sound down an octave, the sample will stretch because it's not actually being tempo mapped. So it's just because it goes lower, the sample becomes bigger, you know. And this is really effective if you want to, like, for instance, have different sounds within the same sample. So let's hear. You see, it takes way more time than, for instance, this one to kind of evolve. I think this is really effective if you want to have different sizes or different qualities to the same sound. But besides, I don't have any effects running on Contact. I just have a little bit of this is Logic's default sample delay, just to make it more wide. So you really almost like sound is coming after the speaker somehow. It's just super wide. And this reverb plugin that I really like, which is Black Hole, which makes everything like really wet. You know, it's a gigantic reverb, so it has a lot of decay. But that's pretty much it for the first atmospheric whisper sound. And I think the second one that you mentioned, which was the truncated one, this is I created on Pigments as well. So I think this is the one that you're talking. Is this the one, Jérôme? Or no?
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty much what I had is let me see if I can play the original one. I picked up this sample. People were like, I was like, it's hard to. There's no words, but they just like, and I thought it was sounding really cool. So what I did is I use a granular synthesis on top of this sample, which is basically taking really fragments, little tiny fragments of the sample. And you see that this cursor is just like random picking out different spots of the sample, which is just used as a random function here in Pigments. So just to add more like randomness to the sound. So if I play this thing without granular and with granular, it's more evolving somehow, you know? And I think this really makes the sound really unique and uncomfortable somehow.
Yeah.
And I think you did that, on the clip as well. But
and a sound like this is, depending on the movie, but a sound like this is harder to use or to place in a way because it brings a lot of attention to itself. But in any scene where we're ratcheting up the tension, or it really gets, it's not necessarily a sound that I would use in a soft moment, or because it's not really atmospheric, but it has so much, it's so much harsher. And so it's really cool to be able to go from in a way, the hollow type of whispers, and then suddenly start layering that as we're building, because it becomes very uncomfortable. So the hollowness can be uncomfortable because it's creepy, but this is uncomfortable because you don't know what you're listening to. It feels very, it's all over the place, but it still whispers. So I love the idea of representing the Dark Maiden through those, because the Dark Maiden, I mean, is she real or is she imagined? That's a good question. I don't know what the answer is. And so using voice is perfect for that. And the voice that sounds a little tweaked or sounds a little, yeah, just based in reality, but processed in the way I thought was really cool.
Yeah, I thought that was a great example of music and sound design merging together to create a really harsh and a really spooky ambience. So thank you for that. At this point, we've got about 12 minutes, so I'd like to turn this back over to Valeria, who will pick up some of your questions.
What's her name?
Xiaosha.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, I just have one specific question. What kind of mics you use to get those samplers for the for the voice and for the baritone bass? Is it?
Oh yeah. So this one that I'm using here is the one that I recorded the Barry, which is a SE Electronics, which is like a tube mic. So it's really good for it's all purpose, but I like it on the Barry as well. So I recorded the Barry with this mic, and these crowd whisper sounds, these samples that I got it in the sound effects library. So I didn't record it myself. Was samples that I took it and I manipulated. If that answers your question.
Yeah, that's the resource. Thank you.
Did you use a lot of your own samples on this, or was it some? I mean, I believe some of the samples came from other projects, or did you? How can you give us a sense of how much was actually new samples, or?
Yeah, I think I would say 50-50, but a lot of the sounds they didn't use samples, you know. So a lot of the sounds. So there are some bass that are recorded. For instance, I think you remember the Moog bass. I recorded with the hardware synth. So that was live. I recorded myself, but pretty much all these whisper sounds that are all I got samples from outside and just manipulated myself. So I would say 50-50.
Valeria, I see we have one question, I think, in the chat.
Yes, we have another question from Sean. So why did you use the Midi modifier and stuck it up in the way that you did?
Oh, the Midi modifier. Yeah, sure. I can share my screen to answer that if that helps. Let me see here. So because me and Jérôme, we use the faders to manipulate the sound. Let me take, for instance, this one. I think like the modifier is a really quick way to assign any fader to anything you want. So for instance, on Pigments, which is a software that, for instance, these macro things, they're not inside the software, you cannot assign them to any CC. The modifier kind of forced that, you know. So for instance, I have here on the modifier Midi CC12, which is assigned to a fader. And that is assigned to the macro one here. So I kind of use that to assign MIDI CCs to anything that I want. And I think that really helps making the sound a little bit more easy to manipulate on the fly. So if Jérôme has the faders on the keyboard, it's really easy for him to change the character of the sound instead of opening the plugin and just having to figure out what I assign to like different parameters, you know. So I usually, for Pigments plugins that we build, I usually use the macros here on the bottom right to have different like gestures or like different plugins manipulation and assign that to one fader. So it's a little bit easier to perform and Jérôme doesn't need to figure out what I'm manipulating, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, we did all this remotely. Correct me if I'm wrong, Roberto, but you were still in Boston when you worked on this, right?
Yeah.
And so if it had been and it was in the middle of the pandemic too, if it had been a situation where you were local and we would work together, you would have your rig with me, or you would come, you know, for a day to work on the sounds, it would be easier to, I mean, I can ask you a question if I'm not sure how something works. But in this working relationship, because of the distance, I had asked, I'm pretty sure I had asked from the very beginning, you know, it'd be nice if I can tweak the sounds to a certain extent. So I'm not constantly relying on you to change something, because once you create the patch, then I need to see how it works within the context of the picture. So there's multiple times, I mean, almost every single cue where I'm moving those faders and really making the sound work. So that for me was absolutely key to get all those modifiers, and then getting in a way that I can understand and say, it's always going to be 11, 12, 13, 14. Sometimes there's going to be nothing, and sometimes it's going to be the four of them. And this is what they do. And so that was critical.
And I think really helps as well as for you being like a orchestral programmer as well, to have, we are constantly using like modulation wheel or expression to modulate sound. And I think that really falls under your realm, like of what things change, you know? So you're just used to using mod wheel for changing dynamics, for instance. So here, I think was a cool idea to just transfer that to, it makes more approachable, you know?
I agree.
Yeah.
Do you have any other
questions? We have another question from Sunny. For the pluck sound, I kind of heard the pitch dropping. I might have heard wrong. Was that some sort of an effect, or did you automate the pitch? Thank you.
Sure, let's see. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you can see here on the RC20, there's this kind of wobble, this function here, which makes the pitch, it's kind of like a LFO to the pitch. So if I make it this really exaggerated, let's see. It makes everything really wobbly. I really like making this really subtle. So it's kind of like a microtonal changes, but it does drop. So that was a good catch from you. But that's the effect that is causing that.
And you can see that it's in the, what's cool, because now the difference between the sustain one or the pluck one is in the sustain, it's obviously the curve that's changing as you sustain it. With the pluck one, you hear that on the delay. You don't hear that on the attack. So it has this kind of like this, again, I think part of a lot of the samples, a lot of the sound design is patches is this kind of uncertainty. It's you're never completely settled, which I think is absolutely wonderful for that type of score at the very least. And so it's not clearly pitch shifting in a way. It's more like, because it's in the trail, it gives you this sense of it's not very clear what's going on. So I really love that.
Yeah. True. And I think adding randomness, some kind of randomness, being in pitch, being in filter, some kind of uncertainty, the sounds make them really alive, you know? So for every sound here, if it was some kind of subtractive synthesis like this one, so we're using sawtooth wave or square waves, I really was trying to push to make the things uncertain, you know, just because the score, it's a horror movie, but it's also, there's a lot of suspense. And I think have something that is really constant just doesn't work in this kind of score, you know? So making these little changes, you know, in pitch or in effects really adds to the score and the final picture, you know?
I love that. And it's part also what makes analog synth so interesting, is that they're not always exactly the same. And that's really the sound that we were going for with Peter, is we don't want something where you just press a key and it's always the same thing. We wanted this idea that's more organic to a certain extent. So that really worked out. Valeria, any other questions?
Okay, great. Yes. So question from Eric. For your sound design recording, do you stick to 44, 48 kilohertz, or do you use higher sample rates?
For this one, I use just 48 because I didn't stretch anything really extreme. So if I was to, I don't know, make it really time stretch, really extreme time stretch, then I would probably record at 96. But because, for instance, at least the sample that I recorded, the baritone sax, was pretty much play it in real time and didn't do a lot of time stretch. I didn't find the need to record at 9.6. If that answers your question. But all the samples that I imported, if I'm not mistaken, they are at 96.
Okay, perfect. And a question from Christian. How did you find this job? Very off topic, sorry.
Yeah, this was something that Jerome posted on, if I'm not mistaken, the Berkeley Career Manager, correct, Jerome?
Yeah, that's right.
I was constantly looking at that page. So if you are at Berkeley, I think I highly recommend for you to check that page out, because there's a lot of things that you can do. Even as international students, you can find a lot of opportunities inside that web page. So I saw this post by Jerome and I was really interested in right away, you know, because I was doing my electronic major at the time, and I think that was a great opportunity to just apply all these concepts we learned in school in a real opportunity, you know. So that's what I did. I saw Jerome's post and I just applied.
Yeah, and if I can't remember exactly, did you send, how did I pick you? Because I know I had a few people that did reply. Did you send me examples of what you had done, or did we just meet up and then we just decided to work together? Or I can't remember.
I think it was a combination of me being one of the first people applying and
oh, you know what, I'll just pick you.
No, I had a reel ready, so I had a,
I think that's what it was. Yeah,
I just did like a more sound designy track for one of my classes, and I just used that as kind of like a demo reel for you to hear, you know, what I was doing at the moment.
Yeah,
so it was both time, but also I had the material ready for you to hear.
Yeah, and I think for me, from my side of the equation, when I was really looking for someone who did not just sound design, but also was willing to do it in Logic and was willing to send me those patches. So it had to be a back and forth. I wasn't concerned. I mean, we were in the pandemic, so what could I do? But I thought the remote thing wasn't a problem for me. And I'm at this stage now, you know, if I need to find an orchestrator, if I need to find musicians, I know already who to call. I have a long list of people to call. But when it comes to stuff like this, I was also trying, now I'm set, but I was trying to foster a new relationship, a working relationship with someone that was kind of like me. I mean, I'm not starting up, I've been doing it for some time, but at least in the synth world, it's really something that I'm trying to explore. So I figured Berkeley was going to be a good place to search for someone who's and it's, you know, it's also it's a small budget film, so it's not like I could hire, you know, James Newton Howard's sound designer, even if I wanted to. So this was kind of like a good way of finding someone who knows all the who's not really an analog synth, who knows more of the plugins and the most modern way of doing it. So yes, I figured that it would be a good way to start, you know, to start at Berkeley and see if anyone was interested. So that worked out really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do we have any other question?
No, I
yes,
think
hello.
we don't.
We have someone who wants to
Oh,
talk.
sorry.
Yes, hi.
Hi there.
My name is Francois. So Jerome, I noticed that, okay, so you're fairly new into synths, maybe a little bit more, I'm guessing, than Roberto, but you clearly guys know a lot about each other's crafts. So my question was, in the cooperation process, how much feedback would you give each other, and how much would you allow to kind of, let's say, you know, work in each other's, you know, fields of work? So yeah, if you could kind of follow up on that.
Yeah, I think I mean, I've been using Logic for 15 years, so I'm kind of a techie, so I'm not scared of clicking, trying different plugins and moving faders and seeing what happens. So I knew, like, Sculpture I had used as a complete amateur, but I had used on previous jobs. But it takes me forever because I have no idea what I'm doing. So I'm moving some faders, and over time, I learned what mud wheel or what this fader does, or what an envelope is, and delays. But it's just been a complete just learning on my own. I never learned the theory. I never learned. So I tried doing synth tutorials on YouTube, and after 20 minutes, they're like, just shoot me. So, but at the very least, I have a decent idea of the lingo, and I knew some of the stuff that I didn't know prior to working on this was pigment. I knew a little bit about modular synthesis, right? But I had never tried pigment. And so that was also part of the idea, is that I can move things around and kind of try to figure it out. And if I'm lost, I can always go back to Roberto and say, hey, I'm trying to do this. Can you help me figure it out? So I brought in some knowledge, obviously, of technology and of the overall concepts, but the groundwork, the hard work, especially, I would say, the original work, I relied on Roberto to do that.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining, for participating, for your questions. Again, check out the soundtrack, which will be posted on Jerome's website on the 5th.
Yeah.
And thank you for your interest in this. Hope it'll help you guys out as you plow your own work in film music, wherever you're doing.